Somehow I know that's not for me. I kind of feel like I'm with a rock star. I said to Sameer, it's like a homecoming, you know? It really is, in every sense of the word, both the football analogy and just the sense of so many people who are here because you know and love Sameer and you know and love his writing. So I count myself among you. My name is Patsy Hicks, and I'm Director of Education here at the Museum of Art. And before I say anything further, just take a minute and make sure that you've turned your cell phones off so we don't have that melodic distraction. And I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank you all for supporting not only someone who deserves our respect and support in Sameer, but also for supporting writers generally, the reading of books, the discussion of ideas, and the beauty of art. I thank you for being here for that. So, and in some ways, I'm not enough of a sports fan to know the right term. Is it a trifecta, or is it? This is the third time that we are fortunate enough to welcome Sameer to share with us his writing. And I just have to give a shout out to the fact that at that first event, and at this one, we are fortunate enough to have his mother in the audience and his sisters, and that's pretty wonderful. So now I'll get more formal. Today, Parallel Stories is delighted to host the launch of Santa Barbara resident, UCSB professor, and museum literary partner, Sameer Pandya's novel, Our Beautiful Boys. This insightful, empathetic, and thoughtful story is a nuanced portrait of 3 high school football players and their families, and a moment of violence that will drastically change all their lives. In keeping with recent conversations about the crisis of young men, the novel explores the complexities of masculinity, race, education, and privilege, and the conflict that arises when all of these collide. Reviewers have used words like riveting, stunning, and electric. And that riveting, stunning, electric person, Sameer Pandya, is the author of the novel Members Only, a finalist for the California Book Award and an NPR Books We Love of 2020, and the story collection, The Blind Writer, longlisted for the PEN Open Book Award. We thank him once again for bringing this conversation to the museum. And we also send our thanks to Chaucer's, who have put up a table and set up shop just outside so that when Sameer is finished and after the Q&A, you can go outside, have a glass of wine, except for those of you who are still in high school, and enjoy a glass of wine and a book signing. So again, thank you all for being here, and most importantly, thank you, congratulations, and welcome, Sameer.
Hello, friends. Thank you, Patsy. I'm really, really happy to be here, and I'm really happy to see all of you. I'll drink more water. I also have a little bit of a cold, so I'm actually not that emotional. I want to thank, first of all, Patsy Hicks and Christy Thomas, who have been so incredibly generous in showing up here on a Saturday afternoon to help host all of this for us. They have, for a long time, we have worked together, and they have been both really incredible and really supportive. As she mentioned, this is my 3rd event for the museum. In 2015, when my first book came out, it was at the McCormick House. In 2020, for some weird reason, we couldn't all gather. And I kind of feel like I've gotten to the adult table to eat because I get to do this in Mary Craig. And so I really want to thank them. I want to, of course, thank and underscore how supportive Chaucer's has been as a bookstore. what a great community space it is, and how wonderful they are as an institution in this town. There are three other kind of sets of folks I want to thank very quickly. I'm going to embarrass my two sons who are sitting up front. If it ever gets loud or noisy, please blame them. I think in some ways my only kind of hope in all of this is that they'd have decent backhands and have a chance to hear their dad read, and so that's really nice. And many of you know better than me my wife, Emily Newman, who's here, who's been, I think she's read most of everything that I've ever written and has been incredibly supportive and amazing. And my sisters and my mom surprised me by showing up yesterday. And my mom was here in 2015 when my first book came out. And I want to thank all three of them. And I want to particularly thank my mother for not, there she is, raising her hand. You get to ask the first question. I want to thank her that when I got on the third try an 890 cumulative on my SATs in high school, she did not panic. And then 15 years later, when I said I was going to quit this very nice academic job I had to become a fiction writer, she did not panic again. And so I think there's a lesson about parenting here, which is panic internally and show grace outward. And so thank you all for being here. I am not going to keep you that long. I want to talk. Basically, what I thought I'd do is I'd spend about 10 minutes kind of giving you some broad thoughts. About 20 minutes I'd like to read. And then the best part of these things is always Q&A. And so I'd love to hear whatever questions that you have. And I'd love to just kind of be in conversation. And then I'd love to share a glass of wine with you. And we can call it an afternoon. And you can go back outside to this beautiful sunny day. So I have done a few interviews for this book. And I think I always get asked this question. I think it's in the kind of guidebook for interviewing, which is, how did you come up with this book, right? And it is an exceptionally difficult question to answer. It's a difficult question to answer when you start a book, when you're in the middle of it, but I think it becomes progressively easier on the back end, right? Where you can think about, right, and I'm not going to bore you with stuff about creativity because it's just boring, but there's ways in which you can think about how a book gets layered, right? And what are your thoughts and what are your ideas that after you're done with the creative bit, you can kind of try to be more analytical about what you were up to and what you were thinking of, right? And so I will get this one very clear biographical point out of the way, okay? Which is that our son in the 9th grade said that he wanted to play football, and I think Emily and I freaked out. And that is where the biographical or autobiographical part of this novel completely ends, okay? So I had this initial idea, and if you know some of my other work, I've had this kind of creative tick, right? Which is that I always find that if I find a situation and try to elongate it to its most kind of counterfactual process, I get to write a novel and think about a novel, right? So in 2015, I published this book called The Blind Writer, and it was a novel essentially, or a novella about an email I didn't respond to, right? And I thought, what if I had responded to this email and I wrote 100 pages, right? In the book that came out in 2020, Members Only, I tried to think of possibly the most offensive thing an Indian guy could say. And 320 pages later, I wrote that book, right? And so this was a way for me to kind of think about kind of a family and three families that are involved in this game, that are involved in raising children, that are involved in being in high school, all of these different things, right? And so my family, we moved to America in 1980. And if you were an Indian American family in 1980, 1982, 1984, you know that these were the only two movies that we went to go see as a family, right? In 1982, we saw Richard Attenborough's Gandhi. which, of course, in my adult sensibility, I have some issues with. For my 10-year-old sensibility, I think we were all excited to see this half-Indian British dude kind of portray Gandhi as particularly well as he did, right? And when I was kind of thinking about these two movies, right, and I'm going to talk about this movie in a second, I did a little Googling, and I found a kind of a video about the producers that had made A Passage to India. And Passage to India was made by David Lean, who, if you know, made Lawrence of Arabia, Bridge over River Kwai, Dr. Zhivago, right? So he's made nice, long movies. And I remember in this video, his main producer said, and it's my favorite quote, he said, David was really angry that Dickie got to put India on screen and he hadn't got to put India on screen, right? And I love that line because, the comfort of being able to refer to each other as Dickie, first and foremost, but this idea that David Lean had to do this, right? And I think I can safely say, and I feel I'm 52, I can comfortably say this, it is a terrible movie, right? It is terrible in all the ways in which David Lean did not know and did not understand the novel. And honestly, I'm not overplaying this, right? And I'm always nervous about making too strong of a statement, but it is all over the place, right? And I think the worst part of it is that, Alec Guinness was incredible and complicated in Bridge over River Kwai. He was an incredible Obi-Wan Kenobi. He was not an incredible Indian mystic that David Lean hired to play God Bully in this movie, right? But what Lean did get right was these really incredible images that were kind of indelible in my head when I watched that movie when I was 12 years old, right? And in the time that I rewatched it as the kind of years went by. And this is, in essence, its most famous scene, right? Which is that, if you know, and this is a novel that was published 100 years ago last year, and essentially the plot of the novel revolves around what he refers to as the Marabar Caves. The Indian character Aziz kind of decides that he wants to show the Englishwoman Adela Quested and Mrs. Moore kind of the real India, right? And says, hey, why don't we go to these caves? We'll take this trip, right? And in essence, in the novel, they make this trip and they go exploring into these caves. And Aziz has walked out, and while he is doing something else, Adela basically comes running out of the cave and falls kind of on these cactus and runs away, right? And what we learn 10, 15 minutes later in the film is essentially that Adela has accused Aziz of attacking her in the cave, right? And so Forrester, who is much smarter than Lean, doesn't really care about what happened in the cave. What he is trying to do is he's trying to say, can we use this question to think about the British, to think about British colonialism and empire, right? All of these different questions that he has. And so this became, and I will kind of just tell you the end, we don't, neither Forrester or Lean tell us necessarily what happened in the cave, right? And kind of leave it as a mystery. And as I was thinking about this thing, I had this joke set up that involves my sister, but now that she's here, it's a particularly good occasion to use the joke. Which is years later, and she's gonna argue that this didn't happen, years later, she had seen the film and left a voicemail on my voice message, and she said, hey, I just saw A Passage to India again. And it's an interesting film, but what happened in the cave? And I think I was enough of a jackass at that point in my life where I said, that's not the question you're supposed to ask. So I didn't end up reading this book until I went off to graduate school, right? So I'd seen the film, but not until the mid-90s did I read the book for the first time. And the book is a fascinating kind of moment in the last 20 years before decolonization, right? When Gandhi has returned back to India after spending time in South Africa, and Forster himself never mentions Gandhi, right? He started writing the book first in 1911 and kind of redid it in 1922 and published it in 1924. When I read it, there were two particular things about the book, right? Which is, what is Forster saying about kind of whether the British should be in India or not, right? And the character that he uses, who's his kind of, not doppelganger, but his kind of extension, is a character named Cyril Fielding, right? But the second question, which is in the reason why this book has stuck with me for so long, the reason why 100 years later the book is still worth thinking about, is that the central question in the book is about unknowability, right? The central question in the book is about echoes. The central question in the book is about the ways in which truth slips out of our hands, right? And I think what's interesting in this particular moment, I don't want truth to slip out of our hands, right? I'm sick of unknowability. I have no ability, we have no ability, right? But so often what happens is the things that we see are, in some ways, the things that people do not agree in terms of what they are seeing, right? So there's a way in which a 100-year-old book and the question at the heart of the book is still so relevant, right? And let me just be clear, and I'm going to say this again at the end, I was thinking of none of this as I was writing this book, right? And that's the thing I tell my students often, which is, if you have an idea in mind, it will kill the story. You've got to just tell the story and just trust that your brain is such a depository of all the stuff that you've read, all the conversations you've had, all the weird films you saw when you were 12 years old when you didn't want to go, right? All of that stuff will kind of find itself there, right? And the line that has stuck with me that I use as the epigraph for this book is, the echo in a Marabar cave is not like these. It is entirely devoid of distinction. Whatever is said, the same monotonous noise replies and quivers up and down the walls until it is absorbed into the roof. Boom is the sound as far as a human alphabet can express it, right? And I spent a ton of time thinking through an ideal epigraph for this book. And I like it, and it works for me, is because part of what I'm trying to have myself think about and for us to think about is, what does it mean when we are in a social space where there are three different ways of thinking about the same moment that occurred, right? And there are three competing narratives, three competing reasons why people are engaged in these truths. From this, right, from Forster, kind of the other piece that has always stuck with me and that I've been thinking about is this particular photograph here, right? So this is a place called Dave Brothers. So this, my poor mother is going to be the conversation piece here. This is, her father was a portrait photographer in South Mumbai for the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And he ran a photo studio called Dave Brothers. And many years later, she'd come back from India and brought a stack of photographs with her. And the one photograph that he had taken that really stuck with me was this one. And the reason it stuck with me was, of course, the complete lack of focus in the photograph, the way in which it feels so deeply impressionistic. And it wasn't even kind of the famous guy at the center. It's this fellow that my eye fell to, right? Is because, in a way, what I was trying to think about was, what exactly is he thinking as he's giving this man a side eye, right? As kind of they are walking, right? I'm kind of assuming this is the Salt March. I don't know when it was from, which was in 1933. And so, in some ways, I was thinking less about him and I was thinking more about him, right? And what it might mean to be an adolescent, to transition from adolescence to adulthood, with this kind of presence next to you, right? And what that might mean. And so that is the kind of the next layer or the next piece that I was trying to think through. And I know I'm just throwing all these things at you only because it is kind of what was working through my mind which then, of course, in the strangest way, led me to, I think, what was the most important book that I read in high school. And I will say I did not read a lot of books in high school, as my SAT scores attest to. This is a book called A Separate Peace that John Knowles published, I think, in the 1950s. And it is a story about two young men, two friends at a boarding school called Devon. And it is essentially a story about envy and desire and friendship, right? And I think what I was mostly interested in, right, 17-year-old Sameer that read it did not say it's about envy, desire, and friendship. He said, oh, this is interesting. There are boys like me who are in novels, right? And of course, those boys are nothing like me, right? But I was interested in what was going on in the relationship between these two characters and what was here, okay? And so the final piece of this, right? So how do I figure all this out, right? How do I put all of this together? And this is where I ended up, right? Which is football. And it's weird. I've written a tennis book and I've written a football book, and I don't think I'm a sports novelist, but I think what I am is I've kind of realized that sometimes we are so invested in this thing called sports, and it is so, and I am invested in it. I spend way too much time in it, but it is such a deeply metaphorical thing, right? In a way that it allows me to tell kind of the story that I'm trying to tell in this book about violence and young men. And football is a perfect way in which we are okay with the violence on the field, but we are asked that it get turned off the second these kids get off the field, right? And these are these two books, Don DeLillo's End Zone, which is probably kind of one of my big inspirations, because DeLillo is always very good at taking things like, and in the DeLillo book, he uses football to talk about nuclear war, right? And so when you read a DeLillo novel, you think, oh, I can use anything to talk about anything. Of course you can't, because DeLillo is so good at what he does. And then the second piece here is not the book, but the TV show, which is, I think, an incredible TV show set in Texas about kind of American football. So my request to you is that now that I have said all of that, I would like you to forget all of it, right? And forget all of it because I think my primary idea as a writer and what I'm trying to do is to tell a story, right? And the story I've tried to tell in this book is about three families, the Shastris, Gautam and Geeta, the Cruzes, Veronica Cruz and her son Diego, and the Berringers, Michael and Shirley, and their son MJ, right? And so I use these three families as a way of essentially thinking through how we talk about families, how we talk about domesticity, how we talk about adolescence, right? And so I've kind of set up these three families as a way for me to experiment with them, right? And what I'm going to do today is it'll take me about 17, 18 minutes, so I will not keep you. I know readings go on too long. I'm going to just read you the first section, which is the section about the Shastris, who are kind of the family that I start off with, but I've tried my best in this book. In Members Only, I used first person, so I could just stay with one person. What was the hardest part of this, and what was in some ways the most enjoyable part of this, was to move point of views, right? And to not, as readers, to not make you feel like you're jerking around as you're going from person to person. But the hardest thing for me is to make you believe me that I've gotten these people right that do not look like me, that do not sound like me, right? So anyway, with all of that said, thank you so much. And please, I would love to hear questions afterwards, okay? Except for the native caves tucked high in the hills above town, the city of Childsworth presents nothing extraordinary. During the day, the three large, craggly black holes set against a lion yellow hillside were something: a historical artifact, a geological occurrence, a living thing, an astonishing view. By dusk, they were mostly abandoned, the dirt path leading to them framed by cactus, sage, and the occasional beer can left by generations of teens looking for a secret place. And at night, the caves had a register and intensity of darkness that made it hard to tell up from down, side from side, boy from boy. Late one night, that darkness would pull all four boys into the largest cave, their arms and legs soon flailing and tangled, the click-click of their bones against bone, their grunts and cries echoing off the smooth walls. Now, looking down, the scene below the caves could be West Texas or eastern Michigan, but it was a bright Southern California fall afternoon, one of those where when you looked up, the blue stretched in every direction, and a bird, no matter how low or well-winged, looked like nothing more than a jittery black dot. Roughly 50 teenage boys in full pads were draped around one another, waiting for practice to start. And right before it did, a new kid walked onto the field, mostly on his heels. "Bin Laden is playing now?" one of them asked the thick boy next to him. "I thought we dumped his dead ass in the ocean," the other responded. They both burst into mocking laughter. "Did you read it?" Geeta Shastri asked her husband, Gautam, later that evening. She'd watched him walk into the kitchen, glance briefly at the yellow Post-it note with his name on it, and an arrow pointing to a permission slip she'd left on the counter, and head straight to the refrigerator. The first stop for a beer had been a recent thing. "Isn't he a little old for field trips?" Gautam asked, cooling his hands on a bottle. "You didn't read it. You saw me not read it." The two looked at each other, neither wanting to proceed down this particular path. Geeta had trouble recalling her once young husband's handsome face, now covered in week-old gray stubble because he'd run out of razors. Gautam just looked away. Apparently, Vikram was walking down the main hallway yesterday when the football coach noticed him. He asked if he had any interest in the game and whether he wanted to come to practice after school to take a look. Geeta was conveying the story and staring at the discoloration on their oak cupboards, now lightened and worn by sun and overuse. They bought the house new nearly 2 decades before, a small development in a neighborhood of old 70s-era stucco tract homes. As the older houses were bought, sold, and remodeled with each turn of boom and bust, their house, once the shiny new thing, now looked frayed and outdated. The old drafty windows let in too much dust, a patch of shingles on the roof needed to be replaced, and the lawn out front, while still green, had large holes from gophers living below. In most everything she did, Geeta operated with order, cleanliness, and just the right amount of sheen. And while the rest of the house was warm and inviting, the kitchen in particular had become the object of her sustained frustration. No matter how much she scrubbed it, it never got the right kind of clean. And with every hole she plugged, another would appear with a fleet of ants coming in, mocking her about the 1 grain of sugar she had failed to clear from the counter. The remodel she wanted, an added island with a stainless steel 6-burner stovetop, walnut cupboards, thick wood floors, would cost them roughly $75,000, maybe more if she got the exact green Rajasthani marble counter she discovered on their last trip to India. Gautam had insisted that they couldn't afford it, that the cupboards were perfectly functional, and that maybe he could slap a coat of paint on them. She'd been annoyed by his use of slap as a verb. She wished he was actually handy around the house. "He checked it out yesterday," Geeta continued, turning away from the cupboards and now looking at the stained grout on the counter. He went to practice today and loved it, and now wants to play." She paused and then added, laying out her argument, "He also thinks having a second sport would be good for his abs." Vikram was upstairs in his room. Their daughter, Priya, was in her first year of college and barely called. "He thinks, or you think?" As the words were coming out of his mouth, Gautam leaned slightly forward, as if doing so might let him suck them back in. "Let's leave aside for a moment how little you've done to help him think through any of it. Isn't the loss of one kid over all this college admissions madness enough? Gautam asked. Geeta looked straight at her husband. When her mother had died, her father, in a rare show of raw emotion, had said that after 50 years, he could no longer distinguish between his own thinking on things and his wife's. She took all our memories with her, he'd said, his eyes filling with thick tears. For the past few years, Geeta had instead felt herself inch further and further away from her husband, greedily hoarding her own thoughts and memories. Sorry, Gautam said immediately. I think we both did that, but we can certainly argue over who is more responsible, and I would win that argument. Gautam looked away, took a deep breath, and had a sip of his beer. After the first couple of sips from a bottle, the rest was just disappointing. That morning, Gautam had arrived at work at his open floor plan office, the kind of space with a kitchen stocked with cereal and protein bars and quinoa bowls to be delivered at lunch, a ping pong table that all the programmers called table tennis, and clear sightlines between the CEO's desk and the interns. He wished they still had cubicles so that he could disappear into one for the day. For years, he'd made a very good, consistent income as a programmer. But at some point, he'd realized that programming was the dentistry of the tech world, solid and steady, but without the glamour of the paycheck of being a doctor. He'd watched the sales guys who knew nothing about the architecture of the software they were selling, making absurd year-end bonuses based on the zeros and ones Gautam had carefully constructed. And so, a few years back, he decided to switch to sales. Gautam had been the 24th employee hired by a startup called Virtual UN. Never be misunderstood again was the tagline of their marketing material. There were other video conferencing companies on the market, but theirs was the only one that had real-time translations in more than 100 languages. If a German speaker and a Mandarin speaker got on a call, the German speaker heard only German from the Mandarin speaker. The German speaker heard only German from the Mandarin speaker, and vice versa. When Ryan, the CEO, and Brian, the head of sales, Ryan Bryan in Gautam's mind, had originally interviewed Gautam for the job, he told them that he would come on as a programmer to help them refine the accents attached to each of the languages. It would give him time to learn the guts of the technology. But then, soon after, he wanted to move into sales. I'm the perfect translator for this product, he'd said in his pitch to them. I can move between tech and sales, between Hindi and English, between Asia and America. The mood at work that morning had been liminal. They were past the collective exuberance from having received an infusion of big boy Series A funding. Now, if they wanted to go to Series B, they needed to make something of it. They needed to sell their product far and wide. Gautam found himself in a similar in-between space. He was older than most other people in the company. He knew and understood the programmers, young Asian American kids fresh out of college, and older H-1Bs from India and China. But now he was spending his time with the salesmen, mostly fit white guys who seemed to have an endless supply of crisp button-downs that never wrinkled. No matter how intimately he knew the product he was selling, no matter his deep love and precise knowledge of the history of Pac-12 basketball, the buyers simply didn't buy from him. He knew why, but to admit it openly meant that he would have to return to the sanctity of coding and algorithms. He was not ready for safety yet, but he was getting there. He had originally taken the job because he liked the CEO. Ryan was in his late 20s, had a programming background, rode his bike to work, and had the air of an ascetic even before he'd made his millions. Most tech CEOs only put on the Buddhist bit with 8 figures in the bank. Gautam did not, however, like his immediate boss, Brian. A week before, Gautam had had a meeting with the two of them, and Brian had pressed Gautam hard about how little he'd sold. You convinced us to hire you based on your translation skills, but that hasn't quite translated into actual accounts. I hope you're saying this to all your sales guys, Gautam had wanted to respond. Coming to work was becoming a chore, and by the end of the day, he was exhausted and anxious and short-tempered. It didn't help that Geeta liked to casually remind him how well their Bay Area Indian friends were doing, with their IPOs, their trips to Kerala in the winters, and their children getting into Princeton. Have you ever watched a football game? Gautam asked Geeta, now taking one more sip of the beer before placing it aside. I mean, really watched it and listened to the bodies crashing against one another. It's brutal. He can try out for water polo. I hear they grab each other's balls, but at least he wouldn't be banging his head in. It's a new white flight sport. Lacrosse is over. Colleges assume you're a rapist in training. I didn't know that was the laugh line. Now you have all these opinions? I've always had these opinions. No one has asked. It's not our job to ask. This time, Geeta paused. Sorry. This time, Geeta paused, realizing that dipping into old arguments in new forms was not going to help Vikram play football. She wasn't excited about the idea of football either, but she did like the ironic juxtaposition with golf, a sport that Vikram did play exceptionally well. He really wants to do it. He's never asked much of us. Their daughter, Priya, had always been the hard one, spending a better part of her senior year in high school not speaking to either of her parents. She didn't trust her father and found her mother too overbearing. She was now a freshman at Humboldt State, studying sociology and horticulture, details that Geeta didn't like to advertise. This isn't my fault, Geeta continued, now trying to lighten the mood. He gets his size from the Punjabi side of your family. There were no Punjabi side of the family. Both Geeta and Gautam were Gujaratis, or more accurately, Geeta was born in America to Gujarati immigrants, and Gautam had arrived in the country in his very early teens. Gautam was a big, strong guy, and Vikram had inherited the weight of his feet, the thickness of his thighs, and the width of his shoulders. From his mother, Vikram had inherited the handsome angles on his face, his deep, striking eyes, and a head full of lustrous black hair. Attributes Geeta could have leaned on through the years at school and work, but purposefully had not. Gujaratis, for the most part, were known for being slight. Punjabis, their neighbors to the north, were known for being big and strong. It was a bit of low-key interstate parochialism that crumbled under any actual consideration. Geeta's family had been heavily fortified with fancy degrees going back several generations. Her grandfather had earned a PhD in chemistry from MIT in the 1920s and had returned home to India, first becoming a professor and later making a small fortune developing and manufacturing industrial cleaning supplies for newly independent India. Her father had 2 graduate degrees in electrical engineering from Carnegie Mellon and had spent his entire academic career at UCLA. She'd studied economics at Cornell. Gautam's family, on the other hand, had arrived at degrees more recently. His parents had both attended small state schools in India and then migrated to the Bay Area, where they had opened and still operated the Gandhi Restaurant, a strictly vegetarian place on San Pablo Avenue in Berkeley, which started doing really well once the customers had discovered that the menu was largely vegan. Gautam had graduated with a degree in computer science from Berkeley, had worked at the restaurant as a waiter throughout high school and college. Gautam liked to intone that the men in Geeta's family were effete, ineffectual intellectuals who'd squandered the fortune the soap maker had amassed. Geeta replied by saying that Gautam's family were a bunch of farmers made good. It was a bit of banter that had spanned the 20 years of their marriage. The joke is getting old, Gautam said, looking straight at his wife, who somehow, miraculously, never seemed to age, and then added, "It was old the second time you used it." "Fine," Geeta snapped. "He can't play," Gautam said. "The game is pure madness. Only the poor kids play, and the white kids get to be quarterback, well protected and untouchable. They just want his body." "Are you making all the decisions now? You asked me what I thought. This is what I think. There are only 3 games left," Vikram said as he stepped into the kitchen, "and they're not even going to put me in." "How long have you been listening?" Geeta asked. "All I heard was Dad saying that they only want my body." He paused. "Well, at least somebody wants my body." The comment released some of the hot air that had gathered in the kitchen. Vikram was showered and cleaned, wearing shorts and a t-shirt. He was big and strong and self-contained, like a semi-truck idling at a stop sign. He walked over and gave his father a kiss on the cheek, now having to slightly lean down to do so. We have to win at least 2 of the remaining games to make the playoffs. I won't get any playing time. There have been a bunch of injuries, and so they need to have people on the sidelines just in case there are more. The injuries should be the red flag, Gautam said. I know, but there are plenty of guys ahead of me who want playing time. Honestly, I only want to do it because the college essay practically writes itself. How I went from the Gandhian nonviolence of my ancestors to the violence of the gridiron. He had a slight smile on his face as he said this, as if he knew how absurd it was and how he'd hit essayistic gold before he'd written a single word or played a single down. I'm just a cliche if my only sport is golf. Golf and football together, and an Indian kid? Admissions counselors will gobble it up. How did you become such a cynic? Gautam asked, winking at his son. It's not cynicism, Geeta said. It's practicality. Gautam looked over at his wife, annoyed that she'd interjected. And this is all coming from him, Geeta said. I'm not thrilled about him being on that field either. Yes, Vikram getting into a good college was important to her, perhaps more important than she cared to fully admit. Where he'd get in and where he would end up going would be a reflection of the success of her parenting, a preview of his and their collective futures. He'd scored high on his SATs without really studying. His GPA was well north of a 4.0. He tutored disadvantaged kids in math. He just needed a few more key, properly curated pieces for his applications. Geeta had taken her daughter's indifference to college personally. You had to pick the one sport that would make your great-grandfather turn in his ashen, watery grave? Gautam asked. You can't just be the big body in basketball instead? Dad, I didn't pick it. It picked me. Gautam enjoyed his son's ironic bravado. Easy there. They're watching. Gautam motioned to an 8x10 framed black and white photo hanging on their living room wall of Mahatma Gandhi striding at the Salt March in 1930, surrounded by a few other marchers, including Vikram's teenage great-grandfather. Gautam could not remember a time when the photo wasn't a part of his life. Like his parents before him, Gautam had hung the photo on his family's wall in the same way other families might have a cross to remind them of their faith. The great man in his beatific smile, watching and reminding them to remain austere and humble, to keep things simple, and yes, most of all, to chill on the violence. Gandhi's omniscient presence in omniscience in the family had never been preachy or insistent, and yet, for 3 generations, a certain Gandhian ethos had seeped into the family marrow. Gautam's father had never raised prices in his restaurant for the sake of increasing profits. Gautam felt the need to keep his work ambitions in check. And Vikram, when picked on in junior high, seemed to instinctively know that the way to deal with a bully was not to punch him in the nose. But was there any sport more un-Gandhian than American football? I'll be careful, Vikram said to his parents. I promise. They teach you ways to protect yourself when you tackle and when you get tackled. And I like how exhausted I felt after practice today. He paused and then slightly lowered his voice as if to make sure Gandhi didn't hear. I don't know. I've never used my body in this way. You know, plowing into other players. It was kind of fun hitting them. And getting hit was not nearly as bad as I thought it would be. You bounce right back up. Gautam looked at his son, then his wife, and then back to his son. Vikram had apparently already had his first practice, and they had clearly strategized about how to make this pitch. Standing there, still feeling the residual effects of a rough work day, he felt a little lonely. He walked over to the other side of the kitchen and signed the release form, which Gita had signed already. "Don't say I didn't warn you," Gautam said, taking a final sip of his warming beer before pouring it out in the sink. "Necks aren't elastic." Neither Vikram nor Gita heard him. Thank you. Thank you all. If you have any questions about whatever, anything, this is my favorite part of this. I'd love to hear it. Hi. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Thanks so much. That was wonderful. Thanks for being here with us today. You talked about knowability and truth in your introductory remarks.
Yeah.
What do you want readers to know at the end of this book? What is its truth?
Are you a plant? No, it's a really nice question, and I blame myself for leading with knowability and truth. It's okay. So here's the thing, right? Which is, I think Patsy early on said, there are things this book is about, right? About violence and masculinity and boys and all of this stuff, right? And so the problem with that, not with what Patsy said, the problem with this idea of placing these ideas, right, like these kernels of ideas, is a novel in some ways dies if it leans on those truths too much, right? So this is this real struggle that I have in this particular job I have of being a novelist, right? Which is, I return back to books that I love, right? I'm certain you have books that you go back to over and over again. And one of the reasons you go back to them over and over again is most of them end with questions rather than answers, right? So if it ended with an answer, you'd be like, okay, I got it, we can move on, right? But if there's a book that you love that you can read through different parts of your life, right? And A Separate Piece is a perfect example, right? When I read it as a 17-year-old, and then when I read it as a 50-year-old, I was like, oh, I didn't realize that these boys were as friendly as the first time I read it, right? And so there is kind of one of these concerns that I have, right? So the vague answer is I'm trying to avoid some of those truths, right? But maybe what I will tell you is that one of the truths that I am thinking about and that I have been thinking about is the ways in which I have to and we have to listen to what these young people are saying, right? And I have spent a lot of time in cars with young people, and they talk a lot, incessantly, right? And it's charming when they're your own children and when they're their friends, right? But I think what I've been trying to think about is when you go past the things that they're talking about, the ways that they're communicating, and I'm not talking about these folks, I'm talking more generally, right? Is that they are trying to figure out how to be in a world that has had, I think, if we think about even from 2008 onwards, all of the various things that this generation of boys that I'm trying to portray in this book have experienced, right? From the financial crisis through COVID, through political upheaval, and on and on and on, right? And so that is a part of what I was trying to figure out. I'm not gonna give this away by saying what happens, but it was also important for me to articulate what happens in that cave as well, right? Part of my relationship with Forrester is I really love that book and I really hate that book at the same time, right? And I hate it for the way in which Forrester, I think, feels great affection for Fielding, who is his kind of extension, but I think, does Aziz poorly in that book. And what I wanted to do was rewrite Aziz in some ways in the form of this young boy Vikram, right? And so, and also his father Gautam, both of them at the same time. And so I may have evaded your question, but I think that's where I am with it. Yeah, of course. Hi, yeah.
At the beginning of the section you read, you toyed with the idea that the book could have been set anywhere.
Uh-huh.
Why did you choose those 7 in Claremont?
So what I didn't read, because it's really awkward to read, is the way when you read it, in parentheses, I put West Texas in 1972, Michigan in 1988, and then I put Southern California in 2019. I made up a town called Charlesworth, and the reason I made it up, and I'll stop with this Forrester stuff, it's exhausting, he makes up an Indian town called Chandrapur. And so the idea, I just wanted a reflection of that name. But what was your question, why in California?
Yeah.
You know, because I really like living in California. And I think California, just like football, and any of these things that are so deeply metaphorical, right? If I could have picked a different epigraph for this book, it would be that great, Kate Wolf line where she says, I thought I'd warn you, the hills, the fruit hangs heavy on the vines, but the hills turn brown in the summertime. So this idea that Wolf is doing in that song between this relationship between its plentitude and just the dry bleakness of it, right? And so that's one reason why I have, right? The second reason, and the other kind of reason this book occurred to me is, I think when we look at the foothills, all the time I see what looks like caves up there, right? And so I always kind of think about if they're actual caves or if there's just a kind of a shadow play that is going on there. And so that's kind of what I was trying to do. But ultimately, I just think I know, the slight backstory to this is that for as long as I can remember, I thought that when I wrote a novel, that novel would have to be about India, right? Because all the novels that I read not growing up, but when I was in graduate school, were written by people writing big books about India. But alas, I don't know that place, right? I left when I was 8, I am 52, I have lived here for 44 years, right? It is the place that I know intimately. I know what the oak trees look like, the way in which they kind of bend over, the way in which the flora and the fauna look, right? All of these things, there's a certain kind of what the winter light looks like versus the summer light, all of those details that I like as a novelist, right? And particularly kind of, and the suburbs, which in some ways are the center of these books that I write, the California suburb is a kind of a interesting place of sameness and difference at the same time. Hey, Mary.
So how do you write? Do you handwrite? Do you work on your laptop? How does eavesdropping on people's conversations or things feed into you? How do you collect words? What kind of fun things are you?
Yeah, I will say very clearly that I am an enormous eavesdropper. It is a thing that I love doing. It is, I'm not spying on anybody. I am just walking. I'm just listening, right? And it is, when you hear people's conversations, you also it's so easy, right? If I'm at a cafe and I'm sitting next to 2 people, it takes 3 sentences to know how well they know each other, right? How intimate they are, what their body language looks like, what details they are sharing, what details are assumed, right? And so for me as a writer, when I think about the formal elements of writing, right? Character, plot, point of view, blah, blah, blah. The thing that I am most interested is in character, right? That who these people are. And the craft advice I stick to most closely is character is revealed in action, and action is revealed in character, right? And so if I have, so you can kind of figure kind of that out pretty quickly, right? To your second question, how do I write? I've always, I think I don't like it being late at night. I don't like the darkness. I think the first thing in the morning is when I particularly love working because I am fresh. And I also like literally the idea that I'm sitting at my desk and the sun is going to rise, right? And that, that when I start, it'll be a dark office with my light on. And when I'm done, the office will be completely filled with morning light, right? I mean, it's a miserable process otherwise, right? So if it's miserable to sit there in the mornings, at least you want to be bathed in like orange sunlight. And so I think, and in some ways, it's always kind of gone through this process of if it starts at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. And I have found that when things are insisting, right? And I know it sounds like a cliche that, you inhabit your characters, but you in fact inhabit your characters. And because you're inhabiting your characters, like at 4 in the morning, they'll say, yo, this is what I think I want to do today, right? And so you're trying to kind of download that. And I do think it is interesting, and I know nothing about this, but when you're sleeping, it is just incredible how much stuff you are working through, and I think the morning time really helps to work through that. Hi, Cliff.
Hey, Sameer, how are you?
I'm good.
I wanted to say that I was interested in your book because of the title, in fact, and that since you work with young people and you work with, and of course, you have your own sons, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges for young people growing up today in America? Would you side with Scott Galloway in saying that, social media is like totally changing things and making it very difficult for young people today? What do you see as some of the challenges for our young boys in our society?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I do think the title for me is from the point of view of the parents, right? And I think anytime you use the word beautiful, it's always melancholy, right? That it's always lost. And I think that in some ways what these parents are experiencing is the loss of their beauty, right? And so when you say our beautiful boys, what you're in fact longing for is a moment when they were in fact that, right? And by beautiful, I just mean whatever, there's innocence, and it's not transitioned from adolescence to adulthood yet, right? So that's the first point. It's so interesting that there is, there are plenty of times where I get annoyed at social media use as I am on social media, right? Meaning that I often get angry at people using it as I have just put it down, right? So there's a level to how much I can be critical of its kind of ubiquity when it is so ubiquitous in my own usage, right? And so I'm saying all of that is because it is hard to avoid it, right? Those algorithms are really good, right? And they get me like they get everybody else. I think there is, I don't know Scott Galloway that well, right? He comes up in snippets on my social media, right? This is this guy who's an NYU, I think he's an NYU like business professor who wears these great glasses and kind of is talking about the difficulties that boys are kind of engaging with, right? And I think what I will just say, because I don't know, I don't feel comfortable making these broader kind of sociological arguments about them. There's a great essay that Zadie Smith wrote about Facebook, right? 10 years ago. And it's called Generation Y or something. And in the end of that first paragraph of that essay, she says, talking about Facebook, she says, the algorithm of Facebook is not worthy of how complex this generation is, right? She says they are better than the algorithm. And I think what I'm hoping is 10 years later or 12 years later, we can just replace Facebook with Snapchat and whatever else and TikTok and say that they are better than the algorithms that are targeting them, right? That they are more complex, they are more ironic, they are more forward-thinking and able to engage, right? But this is not, I mean, you don't need to go to that many different news sites to know, right, this entire discourse that came out after the election about rightward turns, right? And so there are genuine concerns here. There are genuine issues here. But I think for me, writing this, drafting it for the first time now 3 years ago, right? I was thinking about a different set of things. I was just thinking about adolescence, right? And suddenly it kind of arrived into this different moment. Yep, I can't see you. Oh, go ahead.
You mentioned your love of character development, and then also at the beginning, this shift in this book to multi-perspectives. Talk to us a little bit about that experience. What was exciting about taking a given perspective? What was hard about another perspective? What did you learn?
Yeah. It's, so in terms of the craft, right, what's hard is, so if I am in perspective number 1, and then I move to perspective number 2, I cannot move backward in plot time, right? So if you're moving from person to person, the through line always has to be the plot. And what I mean is what's happening, right? So you have to figure out how these characters know what they know based on the plot moving forward, right? And so that's just a hard thing to do, right? And I think the way in which you end up doing it is you just do draft after draft after draft, right? And I think my favorite phrase is, you have to figure out how to erase the stitching, right? Is because books are so full of stitching, right? Which is, oh, this is the movement from here to here to here to here, right? So you figure out the ways in which to scrub that from it, right? So that is one thing, but I'll be totally honest, it's full of anxiety, right? It's because, I read you a section, right? I am not Gautam, I am not Vikram, right? I'm none of these things, right? There is a way in which you can make assumptions that there's a closer relationship, right? If I had read you the 2 other sections in chapter 1, the first, which is from the point of view of Veronica Cruz, and then the third section, which is a movement from Michael Barringer to Shirley Barringer, right? Who are one, and so they're racially all very different, right? And so partly what this book has been, is a little bit of an experiment, right? And it was not just an experiment for the sake of making an experiment. There's no way I can write a book about the slipperiness of what we know if it's not coming from all sorts of different points of view, right? So there's a way in which the story dictated the kind of ways in which I was trying to kind of work out this multiple points of view, right? And I will not say what this means to me, and I try really, really hard not to read Goodreads reviews, but last night when I was feeling anxious about showing up here, I started reading Goodreads reviews, which you should not do if it's late at night and you're anxious. And I don't know, Ivan, if this answers your question, but one of the reviewers said, it didn't occur to me until I was done with 3/4 of this book that this writer wasn't a woman. And I was like, huh. So, I don't know. So it's hard, but you give it a shot and you hope for the best. One more question? Or how about 2 more questions? Ken and then David. Go ahead, Ken.
How does writing impact your teaching and teaching impact your writing?
I think, so I teach in an Asian American Studies department, and my day job is teaching a series of larger kind of issues around race and ethnicity and thinking about class and privilege and masculinity, all of these things, right? Phrases that have really deep, strong theoretical bibliographies, right? Like any of these words, any of these ideas about performance and all of these things that I throw around, right? There's such a level of debate around those words, right? And I feel like I've spent enough time with them, right? They are things that are important to me. They are ideas that are important to me. Now, if I take all of those and stick them in a book, you don't open up a novel to be preached to. You don't open up a novel to be lectured to. There are other places that you can go and do that, right? There are plenty of other occasions to do that, right? And so what I have tried to do as a writer is that stuff has been it's in my head, right? It's because they're the ideas, it's literally the job that I have devoted my life to, right? And so the trick has been, and what I've been trying to do is incorporate them into these stories, but trying to have as light of a touch as possible with them, right? And what I've been trying to figure out is what is the lived experience, right, for me as a novelist trying to articulate this, of all of these people that are kind of working through these ideas, right? And what's so interesting to me in thinking about it in the context of teenagers is they are totally they are of a generation where they have heard these ideas, right? They've consumed them, they've critiqued them, they laugh at it, they're careful about it, right? And that is a part of what I was trying to do. So to your question, I just can't, that's the thing, I feel lucky, right? Like, there's that whole, every time one of these things occurs, right? People will talk about, well, Chekhov was a doctor, and Stevens kind of was a doctor, and William Carlos Williams sold insurance, and they could separate these things. And in fact, I really like not separating them, right? I like that my life as a fiction writer really kind of really blends in with this other job that I have. Hey, David, what's up?
What was the drive for you to start writing in fiction? And throughout this time, what have you received from life in the universe, from writing these books over the last 15 years?
I have been wanting to use this line, which is a line that I stole from Garcia Marquez when he was asked why he writes books. And he said, I write books so my friends will like me more. And so I could say more, but I think we will let Marquez kind of be the last word on this. So anyway, thank you all. Thank you all very much. Please have wine, and I'm going to sign some books if you would like a book signed. Okay, so thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it.